would argue that the biggest, most determinative, defining difference between the two is what I think of as access to capital resources. If you are a for-profit and you've created a better mousetrap, if you have a better product or service, you work in a mostly responsive marketplace, meaning capital flows towards the high-performing and away from the low-performing. In the nonprofit sector, it doesn't necessarily work that way. And a lot of the things that we have to do, and really what I'm going to focus on in telling you about our organization, Share Our Strength, is how we kind of create proxies for that. We call ourselves a nonprofit sector, but I would argue that we are, in many ways, it would be better to define us as a non-market sector. There is not a market for the things that we do. Most nonprofit organizations are created quite specifically in response to a market failure. There's no economic market for feeding hungry kids. There's no economic market for developing a vaccine for malaria, which kills 1 million kids a year in Africa. Sometimes there are political markets for those, but in many cases, the issues that we work on and that we care about affect people so voiceless and vulnerable that there are no markets to serve them whatsoever. And so nonprofit organizations come together to provide opportunities for kids to get an education, to create charter schools, to do anti-hunger work, or what have you. And the reason that they have to do that is to find different ways to compensate for this lack of access to capital resources. We've come up with one of those, at least at Share Our Strength, and I'll describe that in just a moment. The other issue that I think all of these organizations have in common, and all these efforts have in common, is a set of almost antiquated expectations about how they're supposed to do the work that they're supposed to do, the kind of things that they're supposed to or allowed to spend money on. So in the nonprofit sector, we're under enormous pressure to put all of our resources out into the community. And you're probably thinking, well, that's what you were created to do. So yes, you should put your resources out into the community to help people. And as important a goal as that is, I would argue that it comes at some cost, which is the cost of investing in ourselves. It comes at the price of not being able to build what you might think of as a built-to-last institution. An institution that goes out and gets the very best people and trains them and is able to retain them and is able to make all of those investments. When I get on a plane, just as you do, the flight attendant always says that we should put on our own oxygen masks first so that we're better able to help those who are dependent on us. In the nonprofit sector, we're not expected to do that. We're asked a lot of questions, and there's lots of expectations about what our administrative overhead is, what our salaries are, how much we pay people, how much we invest in ourselves versus how much we put out into the community. There's an organization in New York called the Nonprofit Finance Fund, which does really good work with nonprofit organizations, helping them understand a whole range of financial issues and issues related to access to capital. And the director of it is a woman named Clara Miller, and she talks about how most philanthropy, which is what most nonprofits depend on, most philanthropy is what she calls enterprise blind and therefore enterprise unfriendly. Enterprise referring to the core of the organization itself, and distinguishing it from its programs. And Clara says that because everybody in the organization is so committed to creating social value everywhere, all the time, that the result is that the stakeholders of the organization, whether it's the leadership, the staff, the board of directors, the recipients of the services, they basically all conspire to exploit the enterprise for the purpose of creating social value, and they therefore end up hollowing it out. And so I can tell you that at Share Our Strength, the more people we serve, typically, the more people in need during a recession like this, the more we try to do in the community, the more fragile and precarious our own financial position becomes, because everybody is giving us resources to put out into the community. Very few people are giving us resources to build our own capacity to be able to do that. So somewhat understanding this intuitively, but not at all clearly, when we started Share Our Strength, we tried to create a very different model for most other nonprofits, and I'll give you just a kind of a short version of what that is before I suggest some of the lessons that we've actually learned from it. Share Our Strength was created in response to the Ethiopian famine in 1984, which in an era before internet, before cable, was the most compelling humanitarian relief issue that was on anybody's radar screen. So millions of Ethiopians were dying from a famine. It was kind of Katrina-like or tsunami-like in terms of the visibility that it achieved. And at Share Our Strength, we wanted to do something in response to that. We wanted to create a response to international famine, but also a response to hunger in the United States. And we decided that our core competency wasn't doing disaster relief work or wasn't even feeding people, but what was needed was some sustainable source of revenues for the organizations that were good at this but were really short of resources. So we decided to see if we could create an economic engine to do that. And we wanted, in effect, to be a grant maker to a wide range of anti-hunger organizations, whether they were working internationally, like Oxfam, or CARE, or Save the Children, or whether they were working domestically, like the food banks, or advocacy organizations like Project Bread, or children's hospitals or school breakfast programs, or what have you. We wanted to be a grant maker, but we did not want to be a re-granter. This was the only thing we knew at the time we started Share Our Strength, is that we didn't want to go to the Boston Foundation and ask for $90,000 so that we could give $80,000 of it to the Boston Food Bank. There was no value added there. In fact, there was a little bit of value subtracted. Boston Food Bank could do that themselves. So we made this very unusual decision for an organization that started as modestly as ours did. We started with a $2,000 cash advance on a credit card. That was all the money that we had in the world. And that was the limit on the credit card at that time, at least on mine. I think it's still my limit. So we had a $2,000 cash advance on the credit card. We opened up a little office, and we decided that we were going to try and generate funds, but that we were not going to take any foundation money. We were not going to have any government money. We were not going to do any direct mail. We certainly didn't have an endowment. And we didn't have a high donor program. So we ended up backing ourselves into a very tight corner. And what we started to realize is that the only way to kind of fight our way out of that corner was to see if we could, instead of redistributing wealth, which is what most nonprofit organizations do, which I'm not criticizing in any way, but instead of redistributing wealth, we would leave that to other organizations. We would see if we could create wealth. We really believed that there wasn't enough charity or philanthropy to get from where we are today to where we wanted to go in terms of attacking these problems on the scale that they exist. And so how are we going to create wealth? We had some very naive notions about it. Our first was that we would, and we by the way, we had, with our $2,000 cash advance, for a couple $100, we rented this sub-basement office on Capitol Hill, one of these offices where you take, you go down 4 or 5 steps and the windows are up at the ceiling. They're just like these little panels, so very little natural light comes in. It had previously been the office of an electroshock therapist, and there were egg cartons on the wall to muffle sounds, and it was a very spooky place. But it was all we had was $2,000. So the other thing we had was I had a relationship with Steve Wozniak, who had invented the Apple Mac in his garage, and this was I'd worked in politics up until 1992, but this was in 1984, about halfway through my time working in the Senate, and I'd met Wozniak and I'd asked him would he donate an Apple Mac to us. So this was in these days, of course, 84, this was a huge deal. And he not only donated an Apple Mac, he threw in something called a daisy wheel dot matrix printer. Hopefully you've never seen one, but it's quite antiquated now. And we used it to crank out 1,000 letters to chefs and restaurateurs asking them to support Share Our Strength. Our idea was that those in the food service industry, that chefs and restaurateurs would feel a connection to the issue of hunger since they made their livelihoods from food. That made sense to some of them, and it didn't to others, so we had to kind of get to a critical mass. But when we first sent out these 1,000 letters, the naive notion was that we would be the seal of kind of good housekeeping, seal of approval. If you sent $500 to Share Our Strength, we would send you a logo that you could put on your door. Now, when I look back on it, I think, why in the world would anybody ever do that? Nobody had ever heard of us. We'd been around for 5 minutes, and they work hard for their money, and why would they send it to us? And in fact, nobody did. Not one response to the 1,000 letters, which is hard to believe. Just law of averages. You'd think somebody would make a mistake and send it. But nobody did. And the poor mailman, our office was such that with that little window, all we would see every day is the mailman's trousers go by. You'd see about this much of his striped slacks. And after about 3 weeks, I went up and confronted him, and I said, the game is over. We want the mail. Bring it, right? We sent out 1,000 letters. There must be some. And I went and filed a complaint against this poor guy. I was convinced I was delirious, obsessed. So we did what I guess entrepreneurs do. We sent out another 1,000 letters. Why would you do that, right? That makes no sense either. But we got one response. We got a check for $500 from a very iconic chef, then and now, Alice Waters at Chez Panisse in Berkeley. Sent $500 with a note saying, let me know what else I can do. And I immediately called her and I said, I got your note. I'll tell you what else you can do. You can sign the letters. Nobody answers mine. And she did. So we sent out another batch of 1,000 letters, but this time signed by Alice Waters, and we ended up with about 60, 70, 80 responses from chefs and restaurateurs because she was such an influential peer leader to them. And then we started to realize that we needed to find other ways besides kind of asking people for money in this fashion. To make a long story short, we decided to take an idea that was not necessarily original to us, but kind of roll it up, an idea of doing food and wine benefits with chefs. Taste of the Nation, Taste of Boston, Taste of Chicago. They're pretty common today, but they were more novel back in the late 1980s. And our only innovation was that we decided instead of doing these in one city, we would do them in 50 cities on the same night. That we would make ourselves a national organization just by announcing that we're doing these 50 events and recruiting chefs and restaurateurs to do that. And that actually succeeded. And that grew and grew and grew. And we got to the point today where we have about, through that event and a number of others, we have about 14,000 chefs and restaurateurs who are part of Share Our Strength. And what it meant, and the reason that I tell you this history, is that it meant that we had created some value by becoming not just an anti-hunger organization, but in effect a market assembler of chefs and restaurateurs. That we had put in one very convenient place at Share Our Strength, thousands of and we focused only on the top chefs and restaurateurs. So it was Gordon Hammersley at Hammersley's and Jody Adam at Rialto and Andy Husbands at Tremont 647. And we kept it very high end. And as a result, companies that wanted to market into the restaurant industry came to Share Our Strength and said, we want to sign a marketing contract with you. We want to be the exclusive water of Share Our Strength. And so Evian paid us $400,000 a year for over 6 or 7 years to be the bottled water of Share Our Strength. And American Express wanted to be the credit card. I'll just draw one little diagram here. Right on this. So if you think of, I think this applies to lots of organizations, which is why I'll put it up here. If you think of this is the universe, or at least this was my universe, and Share Our Strength is at the center of it. And then all the money in the world that used to be in the world, all the money that used to be in the world doesn't naturally come here. It doesn't really have a way to find its way here except by begging for it, which is not a fun thing to do for very long, which I had no appetite to do. With the chefs and the restaurateurs, when I say we became a market assembler, we got to the point where we had 14,000, even at the point where we had 6,000 or 8,000 of the top chefs or restaurateurs in the country in one place who would do a lot of the things we asked them to do. They wouldn't do everything we asked them to do, and not all of them would ever do it together, but a percentage of them would. So if we asked these chefs and restaurateurs, will you put Evian's 1 liter glass bottle on your tabletop during the month of April as a special promotion to help Evian sell that bottle of water? About 60% of them would. So what we really in effect had done was we created a little toll gate for this money to reach these folks. Anybody could have done this, but it was just hard work to do. One of my economic theories, very simple, is you can't extract value from something unless you build some value into it. And so we'd done something that nobody wanted to do for all the hard reasons that I just described. But it became very valuable. So long story short, since the $2,000 cash advance, we've raised and spent now $280 million on behalf of hunger relief. And 2/3 of the $280 million are strictly marketing contracts. About 1/3 of it today is from charitable dollars because people know Share Our Strength and they do write checks to us. And at the end of the year, donors send donations around holiday time and so forth. But the long and the short of it is that 2/3 of that $280 million are contracts, cause-related marketing campaigns, corporate partnerships. So it put us in the position of not competing with brother and sister organizations, as I described before, of not going to the Boston Food Bank, Boston Foundation for the Food Bank. And it put us in the position of having dollars that don't have strings attached to us. Unlike a foundation, this can be good or bad, but unlike a foundation, Evian never really asks us what we're doing with our money. They ask us how many restaurants put out the bottle, like you said they would. And the same thing with Ilya Espresso and with American Express and Jen Air, which pays us $400,000 a year just to park a Jen Air range, an oven, at our food events so that chefs will do kind of Iron Chef competitions on them, that type of thing. So this became a very attractive model. As I started to talk about it more, started to write about it a little bit, a lot of other nonprofit organizations came to Share Our Strength to say, could you teach us to do something like this? Could you help position us so that we could have the same opportunity to create wealth? It's what we call it community wealth, as distinguished from personal wealth or corporate wealth. It's community wealth because it goes back into the communities that we're trying to serve. And as other nonprofits started to ask us, could we help them, we realized that there was an opportunity here. And as Dave said, we created a for-profit consulting firm owned by our nonprofit to help other nonprofits succeed at similar types of things. I would say related more so than similar, because this model continues to be somewhat unique. But the core theory of the consulting firm Community Wealth Ventures is that most nonprofits, at least many nonprofits, in the course of pursuing their mission, create an asset that has a real marketplace value. And usually because they're a nonprofit, they don't recognize that asset for what it is. If they recognize that they may not have any appetite to do anything with it, the nonprofit may be staffed by people who purposefully did not want to go into business but wanted to go into the nonprofit. So they don't necessarily want to find a way to create a business opportunity from that. Or they may recognize it and have an appetite, but they may not have the skill set to do it, because it is a different skill set than that you typically find in a nonprofit organization. But that doesn't mean that a real value hasn't been created. And so we started to understand that and look at other organizations that were doing it so that we could better consult to those who engaged us. We realized that there were lots of powerful examples. In Seattle, Pioneer Human Services worked with ex-offenders and substance abusers. And they had a budget of about $3 million. Very tough to employ client base. They would train them, but they were having trouble getting jobs for them. And they said, why don't we just create our own factory and find, instead of going to charity, let's go to Boeing Aircraft, which at the time was the biggest employer in the Seattle area, and say, let us become a vendor of something you need. And Boeing said, well, we need precision cut sheet metal, and we need it for the cargo bay liners of our planes, and we need it to these certain specifications, and we can't get enough of it right now. And if you're telling us you have 900 able-bodied men and women who will work in a factory to do that, we will help you build the factory. So today, Pioneer Human Services has a budget of about $65 million a year. They're ISO 9000 certified as an industrial certification, which is, they're the only nonprofit in North America that has it. And so their revenues have jumped up way high, and they're not dependent at all on foundation dollars. One other example, but there's lots of them that we can talk about. In Washington, D.C., outside of Washington, in Rockville, Maryland, Jewish Social Services Agency has a home health care program for the low-income families that the agency was created to serve. The home health care is such high quality that when they came to us to talk about their financial issues, we said, why don't you offer the same home health care to high-income individuals in Bethesda and Chevy Chase and Potomac and other places, and use the proceeds to further the reach of what you do with the low-income families. And so they ended up with a business that generates about $2 million in revenue, of which about $400,000 is profit. We can get into lots of other examples, but I say this because it's important to remember it's not right for every organization. It's something that some organizations, even many organizations, by virtue of their size or mission or culture, probably couldn't or shouldn't do. But it's right for a lot more than are doing it now. So the lessons that we have taken and share our strength from this, I would describe as the following in terms of nonprofits really trying to find ways to do their work more powerfully. If you spend any amount of time in the nonprofit sector, it gets very frustrating because you always seem to be short of resources. You don't seem to have the very best talent that you can necessarily have or attract. That's started to change a lot over the last 10 years. But it can be very frustrating. So as we started to think about how do we respond to this, how do we challenge ourselves to do this work more powerfully and differently than we're doing it or than other organizations are doing it, we came up with 3 or 4 kind of core concepts. One is this notion of creating wealth, being very purposeful about trying to organize yourself so that you're not only redistributing wealth, although if you're doing that, great, then do both. Work both sides of the street. Don't fight these battles with one arm tied behind your back, essentially. The second lesson was learning how, as an organization, to compete, to be competitive. And most nonprofits talk a lot about collaboration, but they don't talk a lot about how to be more competitive in their space. And I don't mean compete to put somebody else out of business. I mean compete to be the most effective version of yourself. One of the lessons, I guess there's 3 ways that I think about competing. One comes from I'm on the Timberland board of directors, boot and clothing company. Hope some of you are wearing Timbs. Up in Stratham, New Hampshire. It's been a rough quarter for Timberland, so if you're not, maybe you will. And it's the only corporate board that I'm on. I'm on 5 or 6 nonprofit boards, and I was way out of my league on the Timberland board, totally intimidated. My colleagues there, when I met them, were the CFO of Colgate-Palmolive, the president of Apple International, vice president of Hasbro, a woman who ran $1 billion division there. And they had lots of business experience, and I had very little. But what I noticed was, and I was really quiet and just trying to pay attention and play catch up, is the things they talked about were so different from the things that the boards of the nonprofit organizations that I was on discussed. And particularly what I noticed was that they spent an enormous amount of time talking about ensuring that Timberland was purposeful and intentional about outperforming their peers. And they measured how they did that. And the most important thing is that they realized that to be competitive at any level, you must be competitive at every level. So Timberland doesn't just think of competing to sell you and I boots and clothing. They think of themselves as competing to get the most talented people in fashion and footwear to come and work in Timberland and to stay there longer. And they invest in measuring how they're doing on that score. They can tell you that their level 11s or 12s, their senior corporate execs, stay at Timberland X amount of time versus Echoes or Cole Haans or Reeboks who stay either a longer or a shorter amount of time. So they measure how they do in retention. They measure how they do on brand recognition for corporate social responsibility. They have this real commitment that if they're going to be competitive at any level, they have to be competitive at every level. In the nonprofit sector, we do almost the complete opposite. We don't think about, we think more about how to get leftover resources than we think about how to get the best resources. We think how to do things cheap and easy and pro bono and donated, and those are often not the same as best and most sustainable and most effective. So again, this notion of biting the bullet, getting yourself out on a limb if you have to, sticking out your neck, but saying we are going to build a world-class organization with the best resources, and that will actually enable us to do more for our mission rather than less, to help people understand why it makes sense to make those investments is absolutely critical. The second way that I think we need to compete is just we need to be competitive economically. So many nonprofit organizations build programs that are in effect gold-plated programs. We have one at Share Our Strength. It's a nutrition education program where the chefs and the restaurateurs are trained by dietitians and experts, and then they're deployed into community centers to work with low-income families and low-income moms on nutrition education and food budgeting and grocery shopping skills. It's an incredible program. It gets great marks in terms of longitudinal studies, and it probably reaches 13,000 people in the United States. So it's a drop in the bucket. It's a very expensive program. It's very labor intensive. And we never built the economics in at the beginning to say, we need to design a program that reaches 13 million Americans. There's a doctor in Washington, D.C. named Peter Hotez who is developing a vaccine for hookworm. He's a world-renowned scientist. Hookworm affects 750 million kids. He's devoted 26 years of his life to developing a vaccine for hookworm, even though there are many believe that there are vaccines for hookworm that already exist, but they're extremely expensive. They've never gone into the arms of a single child. So even though there are vaccines, Dr. Hotez says, unless I can develop a vaccine for $1 a dose, I might as well not develop one at all. There's absolutely no sense to developing one that costs more than that because it'll never reach children in developing countries. So this notion of building your economics into the beginning is important. And then the last way I think we need to be competitive, and we were talking about this at lunch, is in how we're accountable to what we might think of as our shareholders or our stakeholders, for lack of a better term. At Timberland, senior management is accountable in very clear ways. They commit to a stock price that they're going to reach at the end of the quarter and at the end of the year. They commit to an earnings per share that they're going to reach. They commit to a certain sales level. So they have the benefit or the luxury of having these very specific metrics you can use. We went through an interesting experience at Share Our Strength recently where we decided we would commit to a very specific outcome. We would commit to the outcome of ending childhood hunger in the United States. For many years, we had been a grant maker to 250 some organizations around the country. We fund the food banks and the children's hospitals and the advocacy programs and the school breakfast and school lunch efforts and summer feeding. We fund all that, and we were very popular for doing so. And then at some point we decided, well, let's, instead of just feeding kids, or in addition to feeding kids, Let's actually try to get to some of the underlying issues, and let's try to actually end childhood hunger. Now, what I was telling Professor Ager at lunch was that when we convened all of our nonprofit colleagues in the anti-hunger community to tell them we were going to make that commitment and see if they were with us, it turned out that of the 70 organizations we had in the room, 70 were against the idea. There was not one that thought it was a good idea. They were not sure how we would measure. They were not sure that they wanted to use their money to measure their results. They were not sure they would succeed. They fundamentally, I think, didn't like the idea of being accountable. Because in the nonprofit sector, you can do this work for a long time and appear to be a really good guy, right? Everybody thinks this is great, important humanitarian work. And nobody, I think, wanted to risk losing that aura by being held accountable for what could be a success or also could be a failure. So we went through a process where we finally convinced everybody. It took 3 years to do this. It had a very powerful catalytic effect on our organization, ultimately. And about 6 weeks before the November election, candidate Obama issued a white paper about the goal of ending childhood hunger by 2015. It's the first time any candidate has done the same thing, which is put down a specific marker. And the few who had not come along with us ultimately got excited about that and came along. But I tell you this because this idea of being accountable, saying you can measure us, you can judge us, you can hold us to a standard and decide whether to invest any further in us or not, is one that I think is very important as we figure out how we want to be competitive in this sector. Then the last thing I would say is just the notion of what I think of as being committing to be, in addition to creating wealth and being competitive, committing to be what I think of as a cathedral builder, which is just another way of saying committing to do this work for a period of time that may be so long that you won't even see the outcomes of your efforts. I've always been fascinated by the great cathedral builders who spent hundreds of years building a cathedral. The cathedral in Milan, second largest Gothic cathedral in the world, took 513 years to build. Started in 1330, finished in 1843. And the only thing that everybody who worked on it could have known at the time was that they wouldn't see their work finished. It was clear that it was a centuries-long project. And the notion that they wouldn't see the fruits of their labor didn't detract from their dedication or their craftsmanship or their commitment. It actually enhanced it. They knew that they were part of something larger than themselves and part of something important. And I think our work is going to be very much the same. We hopefully will see the end of childhood hunger in the next 10 years or so in the United States. But will we see the end of poverty around the globe? Unlikely. Will we see the end of disease around the globe? Unlikely. That doesn't mean that it's not worth having that ethic of the cathedral builders who put brick upon brick upon brick, simply because it was the right thing to do. So those are some of the lessons that we have taken from this work. I'll wrap up just by telling you one of the things, I guess, why I think, what is at stake in this and why this is so important, this notion of creating new wealth, this notion of being competitive. And what I think is at stake is the opportunity to change people's perception of what is possible, or even their understanding of reality today. I say that because most people think that because of the seemingly intractable nature of issues like hunger, we've always had it. In your lifetimes, there's always been homeless in America. Now, that was not true in my lifetime. There was a period of time in America where we had people who were poor, we had people who lived at the Salvation Army, but we did not have a lot of homeless people in our streets. And so I've got a 24-year-old son who just assumes that that's always been the case and always will be, and he's never seen anything differently. So people think on issues like that and a whole range of other issues that we don't know what the solutions are. But I would argue that precisely the opposite is the case. The only reason I do the work that I do, the only reason that Cheryl Dorsey does the work that she does, the only reason that Alan Casey and Bill Drayton do the work that they do, is we've all seen the impact that it can have. We've all seen the difference it makes in the life of a child. We've all seen how a family has changed by getting certain types of opportunities that they were previously were not able to access. We've all seen what that does in a community. And so the issue is not that we don't have solutions to these problems. I could take you to a maternal and child health clinic in Adams Morgan out in Washington, D.C. called Mary Center that has fundamentally reversed poor infant mortality statistics that existed there 10 or 15 years ago among the Latino population. They've completely turned it around. And the sad thing is that there's somebody in Pittsburgh and somebody in Miami and somebody in Minnesota and somebody in Seattle today trying to figure out how to build a state-of-the-art maternal and child health clinic, and they don't know Mary's Center exists, and they may never, because we don't have that kind of mechanism in the nonprofit sector. But the issue is not that we don't know what the solutions are. The issue is we haven't done a very good job, and I think this is, if there's any definition around social entrepreneurship at all, I think it's the understanding that we haven't done a very good job of making these solutions affordable and sustainable and scalable and replicable. That's a totally different job than starting an organization. That's a totally different challenge, requires a completely different skill set than beginning something to grow it and to scale it. And that's the challenge, I think, of social entrepreneurship today. Your class, your generation, is uniquely positioned to take advantage of something that just didn't exist in mine. When I was leaving school, we had to decide, am I going to be involved in creating wealth, going into business, or serving the public interest? It seemed like two very divergent paths. Today, I think there's an opportunity to create wealth to serve the public interest. And that is, I think, very exciting and very hopeful. So let me leave it right there for now and just go open this up to questions and comments that you may have, please.